Hello and welcome back to the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. Thanks for tuning in with us this week. This week, Jaden and I will be discussing some of the ins and outs of cruise travel.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an exciting one. I think a lot of people are excited to get back to taking cruises because it kind of gives you the opportunity to visit a lot of places in a convenient and more of a relaxing fashion, I guess you could say. And I know you don't want to talk about COVID too much, but how do you think it'll affect cruises kind of into the near future? Do you think a lot of companies will kind of require vaccinations, testing, and what about going onshore and that type of thing?
I have not been keeping up with the latest of the latest regarding cruises, but what I've been seeing and hearing is that, not all cruise companies are requiring people to be vaccinated, but generally speaking, most of the employees, like the crew and the staff, are vaccinated. I think that we're gonna, if you are going on a cruise, that there could be testing involved, that sort of thing. And I think that I've even read things which, again, this is not, I don't have the scientific research to back this up, but off the top of my head, but I do know that I read a survey of regular cruisers that go on cruises, and they asked them how they felt about making vaccines mandatory. And there was actually a very strong component of people that were in favor of it. Now, like I said, I don't know. I've not heard any really hard set guidelines yet, but I think that another consideration is what happens when you want to go on shore. So some countries don't really care. Mexico, for example, there's really very little in the way of restrictions and guidance. Now, in other countries, you may need to show proof of vaccination, or you may need to have a COVID test done. So basically, that it will change, and it's going to continue to change over time. But it will be something that will need to be thought about, because in like some islands, it might just be easier to get off the boat than others. But that being said, I think the economic realities of cruising is that the islands do not want the boat to stop and nobody to get off. So usually there's going to be some accommodations made, I'm pretty sure.
Right. Do you see kind of maybe the idea of getting tested more than once during the trip? Say, if you were to get off of the boat a couple of times and then be required to, say, have a rapid test every 2 or 3 days?
I think that's quite possible, but this stuff is so fluid right now. But yeah, I think going on one of these cruises right now, I think you can kind of expect that proof of vaccination, testing at some point in time. Those are going to be things that are going to be part and parcel of the whole experience.
Right. Okay. Well, moving on from there. One thing I think that comes to mind for me when I think about cruises is motion sickness. So why exactly does motion sickness happen?
So with motion sickness, it basically is a situation where your body, your senses are sending unclear messages to your brain. And what ends up happening is you can feel the dizziness and nauseousness and that sort of thing. So it's one of these things that I think people can get, and previous history and previous experience, not necessarily even on a cruise ship, but if you're more prone to be car sick, or you're more prone to be sick and get dizzy, eat more easily, you're probably going to be more prone to motion sickness on a cruise. It's a range, it's a continuum. Some people won't need much to be affected, and other people will be affected, but it will take a fair bit more.
Right. Is there anything that you can do to prevent it, say medication wise, and in terms of other things that you can do, actions that you can take to kind of avoid it?
I think a couple things you can think of from a non-medicinal standpoint. I think sometimes you pick certain areas for cabins, I think around the water level, that sort of thing, that sometimes can be beneficial to help prevent motion sickness. And, I think other things too, having some rest, and, I guess avoiding alcohol, though on a lot of cruises, drinking is definitely part of the whole thing. But those are things. And then certainly medications. There are a couple medications. Oh, another non-medicinal thing out there is there are some of these products. They're like, one of the brands is C-bands, I believe it is. It's like a wrist thing. Excuse me, like a wrist thing that you put on that's supposed to work on pressure points. I'm not really super convinced that there's tons of data behind it, but that being said, it's like a wristband, so not a lot can go wrong, except maybe you might not like how they look. But beyond that, the downsides are pretty limited. When it comes to medications, we have a few options actually. I'll run through some of the ones we usually think about. Gravol, for a long time. And certainly it does have some benefits. It does a pretty good job of being fast acting, and it works. Tablet usually would last 4 to 6 hours. So one of the disadvantages of it is that you're kind of going up and down on your levels all the time. So you kind of have to retake it sometimes frequently. If you're going to be on the ship for several days before you get off, you may need to look at redosing yourself on a regular basis. Another problem with Gravol is it makes you sleepy. That's definitely a concern. And also, mixing Gravol and alcohol is kind of a bad combination. So those are some considerations. So hard to argue with Gravol at one historical level, but there are definitely some flaws involved there with it for sure. The next thing to talk about is scopolamine patch. The brand in Canada is one called Transderm V. So what this basically is it's a patch that you put behind your ear, and then it basically releases a slow, steady amount of medication, quite similar to Gravol, but over the course of 2 days. You replace the patch every couple of days. So a lot of people have some level of familiarity with patches, whether they're for nitroglycerin or for certain types of narcotic patches or estrogen patches. So it's very much the same kind of idea. The medicine just gets absorbed through the skin, and it's a really small little patch that you put, like I said, behind your ear. The nice thing about these patches are you put it on and it's good for a couple of days. You don't need to keep redosing yourself. One of the disadvantages of it is you have to put it on in advance. Like you can't put it on and it starts working instantly. You need to build up a little bit of the medicine in your system. So it does take a little bit of time. So it doesn't provide immediate relief. So if all of a sudden you're on the ship and you start to feel sick, you can't just put the patch on and like 20 minutes later you're going to be feeling better.
Right.
And then the other thing about the patch is that since the medicine inside it does bear some familiarity to what's inside Gravol, it can make you drowsy. So again, you have to be wary of that. And also regarding alcohol, I still remember I had a patient that was telling me a story. I quite enjoyed the story. They were telling me that they were using the patch, and weren't much of a drinker to start with, but they went out to dinner like the first night, and of course they had a glass of wine, and they're like, "What the heck? I'm not driving anywhere. I'll have a couple glasses of wine." And so like someone who, she said, "Look, all I had was 2 glasses of wine. I could barely make it back to the cabin because." She said, "Do you think that was because of the patch?" I'm like, probably had something to do with it. So yeah. Anyway, you just need to be aware of that. So anyway, that's the patch. And then the third one I want to talk about is this medicine called meclizine. Now, meclizine is sort of a strange one in the sense that requires a lot of backstory. So meclizine was a medicine that was available in Canada for years and years and years. It had a couple brand names: Bonamine, Antivert. Some of these medicines were prescription, and then they were also not prescription. But anyway, this medicine was available, and then basically what happened was the one company that was making it stopped making it. So right now, meclizine is still legally available in Canada. There's nothing wrong with it from the standpoint of because the company that was making it stopped making it, but it's very hard to get because, really right now we have meclizine at our clinic. We have it custom made for us by a compounding pharmacy. They make it for us. So you're thinking, well, what's the advantage to this stuff that you'd have to go through all this effort? There's a couple really neat things about meclizine. It works quite well. It's relatively fast acting. It works within half an hour to an hour. You only have to take it once a day, and it is way less drowsy inducing than Gravol. So those are all pretty good advantages. I like the once a day dosing, and I will say that some people can get a bit drowsy from it, but it's way less than with Gravol. So it definitely has some advantages. I'm a big fan of this stuff myself, and I know that it's sort of my go-to recommendation. It's just from the standpoint of access, like I said, we've got it at our clinic, no problem at all, but it's not something you can just go walk into some random pharmacy and buy a box of it on the counter and take it up to the counter and buy it. This product is still available in the States. So sometimes people will tell me, well, they flew down to Florida to go on their cruise and they picked some up at the Walgreens in Miami or whatever. I'm like, well, that certainly is an option available, but it's not a very practical option here in Canada. So, and
Right.
the other thing is too, American Amazon won't let you order it into Canada just because it's a medicine. So you don't really even have that as an option. So.
Oh, but it's available over the counter in the United States.
Yeah, you can go in a pharmacy and buy it. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Well, when it was available in Canada back in the day, when Bonamine was available and you could buy it, it wasn't a prescription. For years and years, it was a prescription. Then they made it non-prescription and they sold it right next to the Gravol in a pharmacy. But I don't know, for whatever reasons, it never took off and the company stopped making it. And now there's no commercial preparation available in Canada.
Well, that's too bad because it does sound kind of superior to Gravol.
Yeah, I think there's definitely advantages to it. And like I said, it's kind of been my go-to one of choice for people these days for motion sickness. So it's a good option if you can get it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, following that, I think a lot of people who choose cruise travel will also have certain medical conditions because cruise travel is kind of a steadier and safer option. But what types of things should people with pre-existing conditions keep in mind before they take a cruise and while they're on a cruise?
I think a couple things you need to think about would be, make sure that you've been cleared to travel from your doctor prior to your cruise. One of the things that happens lots of times if you need, medical, supplemental insurance, like your provincial healthcare card isn't going to help you on a cruise ship. So
Right.
you need to have some kind of supplemental medical coverage. So one of the things that you may need to do is see your doctor and get cleared for travel and have sort of, what would be considered a stable medical condition with no, you can have medical conditions, but maybe no recent changes in meds or your conditions. All of these ships have medical staffs, like a sick area, sick bay, or whatever they call it. So make sure you've got enough of your medicines, make sure you have any supplies that you need, like, diabetic supplies, that sort of thing. Some of these ships can be more sophisticated. There are like cruises that offer like dialysis options if you need that. Well, that all needs to be very prepared and squared away in advance before you go. But yeah, even for things like just meds and everything like that, bring a med list with you. Make sure you've got some of your medical history information available, so that if something does go wrong, that the people, the medical staff there, have a bit of an idea of some of your history.
Right.
Right. And I know the other thing too, I didn't mention is pregnancy can be an issue as well. A lot of cruise ships won't, once you hit a certain point, and I think it's usually around the third trimester, so they won't let you on the cruise ship. Like it's kind of like with flying almost. It's kind of like they don't want you on the ship.
Right. So you mentioned that they have some form of medical staff. Like what kind of medical care can you tend to be able to access on a cruise?
There usually is like a physician, at least one or two physicians around, and some nurses and some other medical staff. And they usually have like a place where they can, have an exam room and an isolation room, sometimes like an ICU room if needed, and then also even just a few inpatient beds if needed. They have the ability to diagnose and stabilize you and do things for critically ill, unstable patients, but that's kind of it. Like they're not going to do anything that they can possibly hand off to an onshore facility, they will. But if it regards stabilizing you and that, those types of things, they usually have the availability to do that. Like, they've got, defibrillator, they've got, oxygen and, heart monitors, that kind of thing. They can check things out like that, but really, it's not like you you can have like, major heart surgery on board or anything like that.
Right. So moving on kind of from that, what type of illnesses should people be worried about when they're on a cruise ship? And is there anything that you can do to kind of like mitigate that risk?
I think a lot of times we think about very, respiratory type viruses and that sort of thing, like things like norovirus, cold viruses, flu viruses. Those are challenges, right? There's the crew is usually doing a really good job trying to clean everything, but the best thing to do is, wash your hands, make sure that you're coughing and sneezing into your elbow, try to avoid other people's coughing and sneezing. And really, those are the main things that you can do. Common sense avoidance and staying away from people that are seem to be sick and sanitizing and washing a lot.
Right. What types of things do you think people should be concerned about for when they get off the ship?
I think that depends when you're doing a day trip on shore. It depends on the type of activities that you have in mind, what you're planning on doing, what you're planning on eating. A lot of times I think people might have a snack on the shore, but a lot of times people aren't doing major meals because those are already in the cruise. But
right.
Common sense precautions regarding eating and drinking, traveler's diarrhea, prevention, hot, cooked up, boiled, peeled things. Those are things you'll be looking at. And then bug protection as well. When you start thinking about mosquito illnesses, daytime mosquito illnesses like dengue, those are definitely a consideration. I think that one of the questions that comes up a lot is if you have people that are going into malaria areas, and do they need to take anti-malarial medicines if they're on a cruise? And a lot of times that's a tricky one, but a lot of times the answer is no, because
right.
If your malaria is primarily dusk and dawn mosquitoes and you are on the ship as during the peak times, when you're on the shore, it's usually the middle of the day, and that's when the malaria mosquitoes are not as much at risk. So certainly bug spray precautions. And when it comes to malaria stuff, that's something that you should definitely talk to someone who can give you good specific advice from a healthcare provider. The other thing is there are some vaccines that you need to consider. I think the one obvious one that would come up would be something like yellow fever if you were going on the Amazon, doing an Amazon cruise, because certainly there's a yellow fever risk there. So that would be something you'd want to look at. And also in some countries, you can't necessarily always get off the ship unless you have got yellow fever certification. Although
right.
One of the things is anecdotally I've heard is that when you're getting off a cruise ship, sometimes yellow fever requirements that you may encounter at an airport or a land crossing may not necessarily be enforced off a cruise ship, but I wouldn't take that for granted or assume that. I would make sure I have my paperwork in place.
Right. So what other types of things do you normally talk with people about at a pre-travel consultation when they mention that they're going on a cruise?
Besides what we already talked about, certainly I think hepatitis A and B would be other things to think about, because most of these cruises are to tropical places where the hepatitis A is sort of a background endemic disease. Typhoid fever, possibly depending on where you're going and how much you're going to be eating off the ship. Typically speaking, not as much of a concern for a type of Caribbean trip, for example. Dukoral, which is the traveler's diarrhea, cholera preventative vaccine, is something to always consider, although you really have to balance out what your real level of risk is in regards
right.
to traveling or what you're going to eat and drink off the ship. I'd like to tell you that on the ship, you'd like to think that it would be the sanitary conditions would be pretty good and the chances of their getting traveler's diarrhea from the ship would be lower. I think that you got to remember that it's hot, things can go bad faster in warm weather. But I think that
right.
generally speaking, eating on a cruise ship as opposed to eating on shore in Mexico, your risk of traveler's diarrhea is way lower on the ship. But that being said, stuff can happen, and Dukoral is a possible preventative thing that can be considered.
Totally. Okay. Anything else that you wanted to kind of mention about cruises? Anything else that you find comes up pretty often?
I think those are the main things. I find that lots of times, there are some people that really, really love going on cruises, and they're repeat goers. They go again and again. Some people are try it out and maybe they don't find as much for them. But I think that lots of times when I'm doing a cruise consult for some of the first timers and stuff, they, sometimes they'll have questions about, the motion sickness and that sort of thing. A lot of times when I'm seeing more frequent people that go on cruises, it's because they have a specific concern, like a yellow fever entry requirement or something like that, or they have some specific activities that they're doing on shore where they have levels of concern. But yeah, it's those are the main things we're looking at. I think two other things I want to talk about, because I think mostly they're interesting more than they're useful. But I have heard that on some of these cruise ships now, they are installing copper elevator buttons. I'm sort of fascinated by this because copper is really expensive, and making copper elevator buttons seems kind of extravagant. But there's actually a reason behind that. Basically, viruses cannot survive on copper. So
interesting.
If you put on copper, if you could make the whole cruise ship of copper, that would be perfect. But but apparently, one of the most high touch areas on the entire ship is the elevator buttons. So
right.
At great expense, apparently, some cruise ships are making all the elevator buttons and maybe even the panels, but the elevator buttons, they're making them copper because.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I've never actually seen this myself, but I've been told that this is a thing on some ships anyway. So I love telling that story. Like I said, I don't have any real examples. If anyone has any real examples of that, I'd love to hear about it. But there's that. And then the other thing is, in the next few years, we're expecting a norovirus vaccine, which will be really pretty awesome. And that will be something that I think, I don't think it's imminent, but I think probably in a few years, noroviruses are real tricky. There's lots of variations of norovirus, but there is a vaccine that's in development that's pretty far down the road right now. So don't be shocked if a few years from now, we may look at having norovirus vaccine, which would be, geez, I'd be giving that to everyone going on a cruise, I think, probably.
Yeah, I was kind of under the impression that norovirus was kind of similar to something like the cold, like you couldn't really catch it often enough, or like catch the virus and be able to create a vaccine that would protect from enough of them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I know exactly what you mean, and you're kind of right on that, which is one of the reasons why, again, I don't know enough about the details of the vaccine to give too much insight, but I think it's one of these scenarios where you're going to be protected against some of the more common variants, and that sort of thing. But I'm not completely aware of all the details, but I'll put it to you right now. Like we talked, I think, briefly in a previous episode about how commonly we would be giving out dengue vaccine if we had one. If a norovirus vaccine ever happens, we'd probably be giving it to everybody on a cruise, everyone that's in a long-term care facility. Like it would be a huge thing to potentially, if it was a safe, effective vaccine, it would be a great addition to our arsenal of options.
Right. But you kind of think it would be more something like Dukoral, which kind of covers you from some of the more major ones, but there's still like potential that you could still get sick.
I think so, but again, I'm not completely up to date on that. One thing maybe we need to find a guest for the podcast that could talk about some things coming down the line. But yeah, that's the limited amount I know. So I did think of one more thing, Jaden. I went to a conference a few years ago, and it was the retired chief medical officer of one of the cruise lines, and he told me that the worst thing that from a health standpoint that can happen from if you're on the crew is somebody barfing. Like you do not want to be anywhere near somebody that vomits, because if they have norovirus or whatever, the vomit is just filled with norovirus. And apparently the classic nightmare scenario for a cruise ship medical staff is when everyone's getting onto the ship and there's a whole bunch of people like in close contact, all of a sudden someone barfs on the deck. They completely freak out because they know that is a huge bad event from a catchy standpoint. And usually anyone within any close proximity of the barfing person is usually going to have to be isolated.
Oh, right. Yeah, because it's super contagious, isn't it?
Yeah. So anyway, I realize that you have limited control over people around you vomiting, but definitely try and stay away. I think
Well,
that's
I'll
all.
definitely make the effort.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that pretty much covers it, though. So
All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of the Polaris Travel Health Podcast. A reminder that the information and advice that we provided in this podcast are not a substitute for live medical advice that's tailored to your itinerary and your medical history. If you have questions or you want to book an appointment, please head over to our website, www.polaristravelclinic.ca. Also, check us out on Twitter at PolarisTravelRx and our Facebook page as well. We hope you'll tune in again with us next week.
thanks, Jaden.
Thank you.